Grace was the kind of person you didn't notice right away, not because she lacked presence, but because she carried herself with a quiet humility that didn't ask for attention. At 25, she worked the morning shift at a small diner tucked behind a public school on the edge of Portland. It wasn't a glamorous job, but Grace never sought glamour. She liked the rhythm of it, the smell of fresh coffee at dawn, the regulars who ordered the same thing every Tuesday, and the occasional child pressing their face against the glass window to watch the pancakes flip on the griddle. It was a simple life, one that suited her. But beneath that calm exterior was a heart marked by both grief and grace. When Grace was 16, her younger brother Tommy was diagnosed with autism. He had a sweet smile and a mind full of questions, though he struggled with the kind of things most people took for granted: eye contact, loud noises, sudden change. Grace became his quiet protector. While their parents juggled bills and doctor's appointments, she learned the language of weighted blankets, sensory meltdowns, and repetitive speech. More importantly, she learned patience, not the kind that waits, but the kind that stays. Tommy passed away 2 years before Grace took the job at the diner. It was sudden, cruel, and it hollowed something inside her. But instead of withdrawing from the world, she leaned toward the light in the only way she knew how: by giving. She began volunteering at a local center for children with special needs, helping them draw, read, and navigate the unpredictable world around them. Some kids reminded her of Tommy, the way they lined up their crayons or flinched at the sound of a blender. Others were entirely different. But Grace never flinched. She greeted each child with the same softness she once saved for her brother, as if somewhere in the back of her mind, he was still watching. At the diner, that gentleness carried over. When a toddler knocked over a glass of milk, Grace didn't sigh, she smiled. When a mother apologized for her son's erratic behavior, Grace knelt down and said, "He's just exploring his world. That's a good thing." Her co-workers admired her, even if they didn't fully understand her. Customers often left bigger tips at her tables without knowing why. It was something in the way she listened, really listened, as if every person had a story worth hearing. Grace didn't see herself as extraordinary. She woke up early, walked to work, and paid her rent like everyone else. But in the quiet moments, in the way she reached for the child no one else noticed, in the calm steadiness she brought to a chaotic world, she became a quiet hero. Not the kind with capes or medals. Just a young woman with a tired apron and a heart big enough to carry the memory of her brother, and maybe a few others along the way. It was late afternoon when the doorbell above the diner chimed, letting in the soft rustle of wind and the faint smell of freshly cut grass. Grace looked up from her notepad just in time to see a young boy, no more than 10, step inside with his mother. They were quiet, almost hesitant, as they made their way to the far corner booth near the window. The boy moved with an uneven rhythm, his eyes darting but never meeting anyone else's. He clapped his hands twice, sharp, sudden, almost musical, before sliding into the booth. His mother glanced around nervously, as if waiting for someone to notice, or worse, to react. Grace had seen it before. She didn't need a medical chart to recognize the signs: the stimmying, the echolalia, the protective way the mother hovered like a human shield. The boy repeated something under his breath, some phrase from a cartoon maybe, and then clapped again. His mother murmured softly, attempting to soothe him, but her eyes were full of worry. A group of customers seated at the next table over didn't bother hiding their reaction. One man leaned toward his friend and said loud enough for half the diner to hear, "What's wrong with that kid?" Another chuckled cruelly, "Looks like someone forgot to bring their leash." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Grace froze. The mother's face turned crimson. She looked down, fumbled with her purse, and whispered to her son, "We should go." The boy didn't respond, still lost in the rhythm of his own world. She reached for his hand, ready to leave, not because they wanted to, but because they were being pushed out by a world too impatient, too cruel, to make room for difference. That's when Grace moved. She didn't storm over. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked across the room with a calm that silenced the clatter of dishes and the buzz of low conversation. She placed a gentle hand on the mother's shoulder and smiled. "You're welcome here," she said, soft but clear. "Both of you." The mother blinked, startled. Grace turned to the boy and crouched to his level. "Hey there, superstar," she said with a little wink. "You want some pancakes, or are you more of a grilled cheese guy?" The boy didn't answer, but he clapped once and smiled. It was enough. Grace then turned to the table of rude customers. She didn't raise her voice, but every syllable was carved from steel. "If kindness and understanding make you uncomfortable," she said evenly, "this might not be the right place for you." The words settled over the room like a weighted blanket. The group muttered something under their breath, stood awkwardly, and left without finishing their food. No one stopped them. No one wanted to. Grace returned to the table with 2 menus. "Take your time," she told the mother. "We're in no rush." The woman's eyes welled with tears, but she smiled through them. For the first time since stepping inside, her shoulders relaxed. And just like that, the air in the diner shifted. What had started as another ordinary afternoon had become something else, something rare. In that quiet act of kindness, Grace reminded everyone watching that compassion doesn't always come with applause or a headline. Sometimes it just sits in the corner booth, offering a menu and a smile to a little boy who claps when he's happy and to the mother who desperately needed someone to see them, not as a disruption, but as people. Grace had always believed that kindness wasn't something you waited for. It was something you chose, over and over again, especially when no one else did. As the tension in the diner thickened like old syrup, and cruel laughter from the nearby table cracked through the soft hum of conversation, she could feel the weight of it pressing down on the mother in the corner booth. The woman clutched her son's hand tighter, her eyes darting toward the exit like it was the only safe place left. But before she could rise, Grace moved. She didn't rush. She didn't sigh or roll her eyes the way others might have. She simply walked over, calm and unshaken, like she'd done it 100 times before. She placed a gentle hand on the mother's shoulder, not demanding, not dramatic, just grounding. The woman looked up, startled, her eyes brimming with unshed apology. Grace smiled and said softly, "It's okay. You're welcome here. Everyone is." The words were simple, but they hit like a life raft. The mother blinked as if someone had just opened a window in a room where the air had grown too thin. Her son continued his rhythmic tapping and quiet repetitions, unaware of the scene unfolding around him, but Grace noticed everything. She always did. Then, with the same grace that made her name feel more like destiny than coincidence, she turned to the group at the neighboring table. They were still snickering, clearly expecting no consequences for their cruelty. But Grace didn't scold or shame. She didn't raise her voice or make a scene. She just looked them straight in the eyes and said in a tone so steady it silenced every fork and coffee mug in the room, "If kindness and difference make you uncomfortable, then this probably isn't the right place for you." There was no malice in her voice, only conviction. The kind that didn't need volume to be heard. For a moment, the diner fell completely still. Even the kitchen paused, as if the clanging pots and sizzling grills were paying attention. The group of customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, muttered something under their breath, and left, leaving behind only the echo of their chairs scraping against the floor and the bitter taste of their own embarrassment. Grace didn't watch them go. Instead, she turned back to the boy and his mother as if nothing else in the world mattered. "Now," she said with a warm smile, crouching beside their booth, "what's it gonna be, superstar? You in the mood for extra whipped cream today?" The boy clapped his hands once and giggled, rocking slightly in his seat. The mother smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since walking through the door. Her eyes, still glassy, now sparkled with something different. Relief. Gratitude. Maybe even hope. Grace took their order as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No fuss, no pity. Just service with respect. She brought out the boy's sundae with an extra cherry on top and called him champ as she set it down. No one stared anymore. No one whispered. The rest of the diners returned to their meals, their conversations somehow softer, more thoughtful. Something had shifted. In the space of a few quiet minutes, Grace had taken a moment of cruelty and turned it into something sacred. Not with outrage, but with dignity. Not with spectacle, but with soul. It was just another shift at the diner, but for one boy, one mother, and everyone watching, it was something they'd never forget. In the far corner of the diner, half hidden behind a faded newspaper and a chipped coffee mug, sat a man who looked like he belonged anywhere but in the spotlight. He wore a plain navy windbreaker, jeans that had seen better days, and a pair of scuffed brown shoes that suggested he'd done more walking in his life than most men with private jets. No one gave him a second glance, not the teenagers at the counter, not the cook in the back, not even Grace. And that's exactly how Benjamin Cole liked it. To most of the world, Benjamin was a name printed in bold headlines and whispered in boardrooms. A tech visionary. A billionaire. The man who'd once revolutionized communication software before vanishing from public life 5 years ago. But today, he was just a man on a quiet layover, halfway between a meeting in Seattle and a keynote speech in San Francisco. He hadn't planned on stopping at the little diner. It was an impulse, a left turn on a back road when he needed a break from emails, conference calls, and the constant pressure of building empires. He had ordered black coffee, nothing more, and was halfway through an article he wasn't really reading when the scene at the next booth unfolded. At first, he wasn't sure what he was witnessing. Just a mother and her son. Then he noticed the boy's behavior, the repetitive clapping, the softly muttered phrases, the fixed gaze that never quite landed. Benjamin's chest tightened, almost reflexively. He had seen those gestures before many times, in his own home. His grandson, Caleb, was 10 now. A bright, beautiful boy who could name every planet in our solar system but couldn't bear the sound of a vacuum cleaner. Caleb didn't like crowds or changes in routine, and he only let a handful of people into his world. Benjamin had tried, awkwardly at first, then more patiently as the years passed. It hadn't been easy. Empires were simple compared to understanding a child whose mind moved in patterns most couldn't see. So when Benjamin saw the group of customers mocking the boy, saw the mother shrink into herself, ready to flee, his stomach turned. He'd seen that scene play out too many times. The judgment, the isolation, the silent exits through back doors. But then something different happened. Grace. She moved with calm purpose, offering comfort to the mother, then turning with quiet fire to those who had spoken in cruelty. Benjamin lowered his paper slightly, just enough to see her face. There was no rage in her eyes, only strength, the kind that came from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. When she addressed the table of offenders, her voice never rose. But it didn't have to. Her words carried weight. They filled the room, steady and unshakable. And then she turned her attention to the boy, calling him superstar, like it was the most natural thing in the world. No pity, no hesitation. Just kindness. Benjamin watched the entire exchange unfold without moving. He didn't take notes or make calls. He didn't need to. What he had witnessed said more about character than any resume ever could. Grace wasn't performing. She wasn't aware of eyes on her. She was simply doing what she believed was right, in a world that often didn't bother. By the time the boy was digging happily into a sundae and the mother had begun to breathe again, Benjamin knew his visit to this little diner had not been a detour. It had been a moment he was meant to see. And Grace? She wasn't just a waitress in a dusty apron. She was the kind of person who could change lives, simply by being herself. The next day, just after the lunch rush had settled and the diner returned to its usual mid-afternoon lull, the door swung open with a quiet chime. Grace glanced up from the register, expecting another regular looking for coffee and pie. Instead, she saw the same man from the corner booth, the one who'd sat silently with a newspaper and a steady gaze the day before. He looked exactly as he had then, unassuming, calm, like someone who had seen more of the world than he let on. He walked in without fanfare, but something in his posture was different. More deliberate. He chose a seat by the window this time, placing his jacket neatly beside him and opening the menu, though he didn't seem to be reading it. When Grace approached with her usual easy smile, he looked up and said, "If it's all right with you, I'd like you to be the one to take my order." Grace raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Sure thing," she said, pen and notepad in hand. He ordered a simple meal, grilled salmon, side salad, and a glass of iced tea. Nothing extravagant. Grace didn't linger, didn't pry. She treated him like any other customer, the way she always did. But beneath her professional calm, a flicker of curiosity sparked. There was something about his presence, something familiar yet out of place in a small-town diner. She couldn't quite place it. The meal passed quietly. The man ate slowly, savoring each bite, occasionally looking out the window like he was searching for something beyond the glass. When he finished, Grace returned to clear the table. As she reached for his plate, he stopped her gently with a question that came out of nowhere but landed with weight. "Do you know what you did yesterday?" She blinked. "Excuse me." He leaned back in his seat, not with arrogance, but with the air of someone who had spent years listening before speaking. "You didn't just stand up to a group of rude people. You changed something. For that boy. For his mother. For everyone who was watching, even if they didn't realize it." Grace stood still for a moment, the plate still in her hands. She wasn't used to being the subject of conversations. Compliments made her uneasy. Recognition wasn't something she sought. "I didn't do anything special," she said finally, her voice quiet but certain. "I just stood on the side of what's right. Someone who's different, someone special, deserves to be treated with special kindness. That's all." The man nodded slowly, as if turning her words over in his mind like rare stones. "That kind of thinking," he said after a pause, "is rarer than you think. And more valuable than you know." Grace smiled politely and reached again for the plate. "Would you like dessert?" He shook his head. "No, thank you. I got what I came for." There was something final in the way he said it, but not unkind. More like someone who had found what they didn't know they were looking for. He paid in cash, left a generous tip, and rose to leave. But before stepping out the door, he paused. He turned back to Grace, eyes steady, and said, "You're going to do something important, you know. Maybe you already are." Then he was gone, the bell over the door chiming behind him. Grace stood there for a moment longer, her hands still full, the words hanging in the air like sunlight through the window. She didn't know exactly who he was. Not yet. But something told her, whoever he was, he had just seen something in her she hadn't quite seen in herself. The diner had quieted again after the man left. Grace went about wiping down tables and refilling the sugar caddies, the kind of routine that settled her nerves and brought a sense of order to the day. She hadn't thought much more about their conversation, at least not out loud. But inside, his words lingered like a gentle hum, the kind that stays with you long after the music stops. She didn't know who he really was, only that he'd seen something in her and named it with more weight than she was used to carrying. It wasn't until she reached his table to clear the dishes that she noticed the envelope. It was tucked beneath his empty coffee mug, almost hidden, like he hadn't wanted it to be found right away. Her fingers brushed over the edge of the white paper, and she hesitated for a moment before picking it up. There was no name on the outside, no elaborate logo, just her name written in neat, careful script. Grace. She looked around, half expecting someone to say it was a mistake or a joke. But the table was empty. The street outside the window was quiet. With a strange mix of caution and curiosity, she opened the envelope. The first thing she saw was a check. At first, her brain couldn't process the number. Too many zeros for a waitress's paycheck, that was for sure. She blinked. Looked again. $100,000. Made out to her, signed in ink, completely real. Her breath caught. She had to sit down. Beneath the check was a handwritten note. The paper was thick, the handwriting elegant and deliberate. It read, "The world needs more people like you. Use this to create a safe place for the other superstars out there, the ones the world doesn't always understand, but who deserve to shine. There was no signature, but she didn't need one. She knew who it was from. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the note back into the envelope, heart pounding like she'd just run a mile. For a moment, she sat still in that booth, where so many ordinary conversations happened over hash browns and black coffee, and let the reality of it sink in. This wasn't just a generous tip. It wasn't even about the money. It was a message. A vote of confidence from someone who had watched her, really seen her, and believed she could do something bigger than just serve meals and refill drinks. And deep down, maybe she had always hoped for that chance, just never imagined it would come tucked under a coffee mug. She thought about the kids she worked with at the community center. The ones who clapped too loud or spoke too little. The ones who colored outside the lines and needed breaks in quiet corners when the world got too loud. They were all superstars in their own way, bright, unique, misunderstood. Now, maybe she could give them something more. Not just kindness in the moment, but a space of their own. A place where no one stared. Where no one whispered or mocked. A place where being different didn't mean being unwelcome. She pressed the envelope to her chest and closed her eyes for a second, just long enough to let gratitude settle in her bones. Grace didn't know exactly what the future would look like. But for the first time in a long time, it felt wide open, and quietly extraordinary. 6 months later, the corner lot that once held a dusty pawn shop had been transformed into something entirely new. Sunlight spilled through tall front windows, lighting up shelves filled with picture books, puzzles, and jars of crayons. Inside, soft music played and the smell of fresh-baked muffins drifted through the air. Children laughed, not loudly but freely, as they built towers from wooden blocks or curled up with storybooks in beanbag chairs. The walls were painted in calming hues of blue and green, and in one corner stood a sensory nook draped in fabric, filled with weighted blankets and soft toys. At the heart of it all stood Grace, apron tied neatly around her waist, greeting every family with a smile that said, "You're home." She called it the Quiet Corner, a name born from her own memories of needing peace in a loud, judgmental world. It wasn't just a diner. It was a refuge. A place where kids who flapped their hands, spoke in echoes, or couldn't sit still weren't asked to change. They were welcomed. Celebrated. Seen. The money Benjamin had left her had made it possible, but the vision, that had always been hers. Every detail was intentional. Menus with picture symbols. Staff trained in neurodiversity. Noise-canceling headphones available by the door. And most importantly, a policy of radical acceptance. Word spread faster than she ever expected. Parents who had spent years avoiding restaurants began making weekly visits. Stories were shared online. Videos of children dancing freely beside their plates of pancakes went viral. Letters poured in, thank you notes, donations, stories of long-held shame now replaced by belonging. And on the front window, etched in white vinyl letters, were the words that defined it all. We don't need you to be normal, just to be yourself. For Grace, it wasn't about recognition or success. It was about one simple truth she had always known deep in her bones. Everyone deserves a seat at the table, exactly as they are. And now, thanks to one quiet act of kindness, and one unexpected believer, a whole new table had been set. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness leave the deepest mark. Grace wasn't a public figure, a doctor, or a celebrity. She was a waitress in a small-town diner. But in a single moment, when she chose compassion over comfort and dignity over silence, she reminded us all of something timeless. How we treat those who are different reveals who we truly are. For many of us, especially those who've lived long enough to see the world change in ways both beautiful and troubling, Grace's story is a gentle but powerful call to return to what matters. Kindness. Inclusion. Courage in quiet moments. In a society that often moves too fast to notice the vulnerable, Grace stopped, saw, and embraced. You don't need a fortune to change the world. Sometimes all it takes is a warm voice, a steady hand, and the willingness to say, "You belong here." Whether you're 75 or 25, it's never too late to be that person, at the grocery store, at church, or right at your own kitchen table. Because in the end, what we leave behind won't be our titles or possessions, it will be the way we made others feel. Just like Grace. So if Grace's story moved you, if it reminded you of the kind of kindness the world still needs, don't let it stop here. At Justice Reloaded HD, we believe in shining a light on the quiet heroes, the overlooked moments, and the courage it takes to simply do what's right. Every story we share is meant to inspire, to heal, and to remind us that compassion is never wasted. If you believe the world needs more stories like this, stories that speak to the heart, then please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that goodness still exists. Because sometimes, all it takes is one small act of grace to change everything.